This is apropos. The Ukrainian president is accusing US envoy Steve Witkoff, who's here in Paris after meeting Vladimir Putin last Friday, of spreading Russian narratives. He suggested that any peace deal with Moscow hinges on the status of Ukraine's occupied territories, comments described by Zelensky as very dangerous. It comes as Donald Trump says the US will sign a deal with Ukraine on access to its critical minerals next Thursday. August Atkinson has the latest.
After months of delays, a minerals deal is closer than ever. Ukraine said talks with the US delivered good results and that both sides are preparing to finalize the agreement.
We have positive intentions. We are constructive. We're showing that. The memorandum of intentions, not the deal itself, can be signed online even today.
The deal would give the US access to Ukraine's mineral wealth in return for billions in military aid. Ukraine, for its part, wants strong security guarantees. But the process has been shaky. A February signing fell through under chaotic circumstances. Since then, Ukraine said that the terms have constantly changed. Media reports said the US now has changed repayment demands from $300 to $100 billion. Meanwhile, the Trump administration continued to face accusations of echoing Putin, creating unease among Ukraine officials. Just days ago, the US envoy Steve Witkoff conveyed Moscow's proposal for a peace in exchange for 5 Ukrainian regions.
I believe that Mr. Witkoff has taken on the strategy of the Russian side. I think it is very dangerous.
Ukraine said it will not discuss territorial agreements before a ceasefire, a truce they want under US security guarantees. But so far it's not clear how the minerals deal would ensure Ukraine's security.
For more, let's bring in Francis Farrell, a reporter with the Kyiv Independent. Thanks so much, Francis, for being with us on the programme this evening. Let's start perhaps with that minerals deal. Donald Trump saying earlier that it's set to be signed next Thursday. Earlier in the day, we had President Zelensky suggesting that a memorandum of intent might be on the table for today. The two leaders don't seem to be exactly on the same page here, or are they? What's being said in Ukraine about all of this?
Yeah, so thank you. The view on the minerals deal from here inside Ukraine, whether it's from the Frontline to politicians to society, is the understanding that this is a really exploitative deal, really typical of, I guess you could say, President Trump's gangster-style diplomacy. And the big question is if Ukraine is to be compelled to give up so much of its rich resource wealth, which could take a long time to be even exploited. But even if it is to give up this in theory, what will it really be getting from the US in return? Now, Washington has said that this is in itself a security guarantee, which is difficult to believe when American companies and diplomats were already in Ukraine when Russia launched its full-scale invasion. So in theory, what we understand here in Ukraine is that what Ukraine is getting in return for this deal is simply the promise of Washington not to abandon Ukraine quite yet.
And we also heard from Zelensky today pointing out that Russia had been striking, as far as the situation is on the ground, fewer energy facilities, for example, despite the 30-day moratorium that's supposed to be in place, and it has been instead attacking more civilian infrastructure. So how exactly has this moratorium been playing out on the ground, Francis?
I think it's important just to understand that this so-called ceasefire or moratorium is taking place in a post-truth world where the big players, whether it's Washington or Moscow, are pretty comfortable with operating outside given facts. Now, Russia is still seeming to try and be careful in terms of not immediately aggravating Trump with such a blatant violation of that moratorium. But as for their attacks on cities, they've continued, and they've, as you said, in fact, intensified those attacks. And it's just another reminder that while Ukraine has said they're ready for a ceasefire, an unconditional 30-day ceasefire, Ukraine is ready for peace. Russia clearly wants more and wants to keep going.
And Francis, meanwhile, we've had quite a long day of diplomacy here in Paris. The Elysee tonight saying that the fact that these talks took place at all shows that Europe and Ukraine are back at the table, that this ceasefire, if it happens, is not going to be negotiated solely between Russia and the US. But what do people make of this in Kyiv? And does it actually show that the US is starting to take European concerns more seriously?
It's important to remember that whatever deals, whatever talks happen between the US and Europe, and the US and Ukraine, and Europe and Ukraine, peace cannot be possible unless Russia stops on the battlefield, first and foremost. And there seems to be still a bit of an enduring reluctance to understand that in Europe, when they talk about basically needing to be at the table. They do need to be at the table, but none of this really matters unless it can be translated into direct pressure on Russia to stop. And for that, the US needs to be on board, and they need to show clear evidence that they're ready to put that pressure on. And when we see Envoy Steve Witkoff coming out of Moscow, really repeating not only Russian disinformation narratives, as Zelensky mentioned, but basically repeating Russia's basic demands without any understanding of the need for a compromise, it seems like we're still pretty far away from that.
And Francis, you've reported quite recently from the front line in Donetsk. What do you think it will actually take for Moscow to agree to a ceasefire, and what role can Europe actually play?
Well, the view from here inside Ukraine, especially here on the front line, is that the only way to stop Russia is on the battlefield. And of course, other factors play into that, including aid to Ukraine, strong, brave political moves, especially from Europe. But first and foremost, Russia will only stop. We know they want more regions of Ukraine. They will only stop if they cannot move forward physically here on the battlefield. We see that their spring offensive has begun, and it's not necessarily one attempt to capture one piece of territory. It is a general increasing of intensity of attacks and pressure on what is still overstretched Ukrainian defense, but one, thankfully, that has the right and has the ability to keep fighting for a long time. Now, because of that, because of Russia's unwillingness to stop, and because of seemingly Washington's unwillingness to put any hard pressure on Moscow, when it comes to Europe and France in particular, we might see the need to ignore this understanding that maybe they'll need to come in just to reinforce a ceasefire, and think more about how they'll need to make that ceasefire by taking braver steps earlier.
And Zelensky also today warned, when it comes to what's happening on the ground there in Ukraine, that Russia appears to be amassing 60,000 troops, he said, near Sumy. That's, of course, where we saw 35 people killed in a Russian missile strike at the weekend. Has that added impetus to the talks that we saw in Paris today, to those efforts to reach some kind of deal?
I would not say so. We know that there's going to be a difficult campaign in spring and summer with intensified Russian attacks all across the front line, from Sumy to Kharkiv to where I am now in Donetsk. We see this in the last few days. Ukraine has a lot of very capable units up in Sumy, and they do have the state border, which is pretty well fortified. So if Russia does try to push much further, of course, that's the area where Ukraine was holding Russian territory for a long time until recently. But if Russia tries to push forward across the border, they're in for a very, very tough fight. But none of this is isolated in one region of Ukraine. This is about an overall war of attrition between Russia and Ukraine, in which Russia, being the attacking force and having no regard for the lives of its soldiers, is losing many more people. But Ukraine is also suffering a manpower crisis of its own in defense. And the way that balance goes from spring and summer is probably actually going to be the most important factor going into these ongoing peace negotiations.
Francis, we'll have to leave it there for now. Thanks so much for being with us this evening. That's Francis Farrell, a journalist with the Kyiv Independent in Ukraine.